Good. Thank you all for joining me and us and everyone else here this nice Monday afternoon. I am sitting in my office in Manchester right now. Um, and I hope that this background is not too distracting for you, but I'm going to jump straight in and just a couple of things before then. So Brian is absolutely correct. I've been working as a photographer and an artist for more than 20 something years around the world. I'm not going to try to do a survey of everything that I've done. It doesn't make any sense. I'm going to give you a little taste of things that I've been doing and how they actually connected in terms of my interest in uh, locations and space and how photography fits in that. And we'll give probably half of my talk more emphasis of what actually I've been doing 2020. And 2020 is not even over yet, and I'm sure that it's been a very full of turmoil and changes and excitements and hard ache and everything else, and it's not even over, and we still have in a week, 10 days, we still have elections to go through. So it's going to be a very crazy year for everyone, I'm sure. So I'm going to start by sharing a screen. Can I share a screen? I'm already authorized. Yes. And I guess those dings are from allowing people in.
Yes, right? That's correct.
Okay. Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. If by any means, we can wait until the end for questions, but I'm really happy to discuss whatever you want. And if you did not understand something that I said, or you would like a couple more sentences about this topic, I'll be happy to stop and talk about that. So, feel free to burst in or wait until the end. So as Brian actually introduced me, I was born in Israel and I started photographing in a very early age. This is a photograph I made when I was probably 14 years old, which will make it more than 30 years ago. This was my dog. And the reason why I'm showing it, because this is one of the first instances, I think, in my life that I looked at a photograph and I realized that photographs are not reality. They capture some sort of interpretation of reality, but they're not what I saw and how this dog is actually, the existence of this dog. And that's, and I started taking pictures around that time when I was 13, 14 and kept on doing that throughout high school. And then like most everyone else in the state of Israel, you are drafted into the military. And I spent 3 years there, which was not a very creative or inspiring time in terms of my art or my photography. But upon the end of my service in 1996, I actually got a job. I saved some money and I thought about going to New York. And in 1997, I arrived in New York without much of a plan. I knew I was going to stay in New York for a couple of weeks. I made some pictures, of course. This is a photograph I made of Broadway downtown. And after more than a year in New York, I decided that I really need to take photography more seriously. And I moved to Boston to go to school. And for the next couple of years, I'm going to show you very few pictures. I was experimenting. I was making pictures in the style of great characters and people from the history of photography I learned about. Street photography, I worked in color, I worked with half frame camera, I worked with large format camera, I worked with black and white and color. There was no digital at the time, but I was actually making photographs that I overall was happy with, but they were not really mine. They were all made in the style of others. And there was not really a sense of any kind of unified theme in my work at that time. You can see all these pictures when I flip them, right? Not right? Can somebody confirm? Because you're all muted.
Yes, we can see. Yes.
Okay. And I enjoy making those photographs, but they were not really unique to me or to what I was really interested in. Until 2001, when I was commissioned to go with another photographer and a writer to Navajo country, which is in New Mexico and Arizona area. And this was the first time somebody actually paid me to go and take pictures somewhere. But most interestingly, I had to work in a specific location. The premise of the project was to actually track down or go back to areas in Navajo country and Zuni and Hopi, three Native American tribes in the Southwest, and look at their trading posts, and the trading posts that were so prominent for many, many years in terms of arts and crafts trade, of goods, were starting to disintegrate, partially because the introduction of American life to the reservations, part because there was not really any kind of economic maybe justification for that. But in terms of me as a photographer, I was presented with specific places, and now the challenge is how to make an interesting photograph in those places, how to make photographs that actually mean something about the place that I was assigned to photograph. Because essentially I can write whatever I want on the photograph, but the visual is what really tells the story. And at the time when I'm taking this photograph, those kind of payphones are considered to be modernity in terms of Navajo trading posts. And I was trying to make these kind of pictures that about this conflict of old traditional and more new technological. And we spent close to 2 months in the Southwest and worked very hard and made a lot of pictures and finished this project in August in terms of photographing. And I started working in the darkroom, making prints, developing film, doing all those things. And then this happened. And I'm not sure, what is the average age we have here, but 19 years ago when the World Trade Center attack happened, that pretty much changed a lot of things in American culture. And at the time I lived in Boston, and this was the first time that I experienced something of that magnitude in the United States. And at the same time that right after the World Trade Center was brought down, those letters, laced with anthrax were started sending to senators and to people in the United States. And the reaction was that people literally stopped taking mail. And right after that, there was two guys that, something happened to my, no. There was these two guys who were shooting people in the Washington area, and the response to overall the country was that kids do not have any more field trips. And that made me think about where I grew up. And I grew up in Jerusalem in the 1970s and 80s. And I have a very clear memory of being probably no more than 7 or 8 years old. And I went downtown to downtown Jerusalem with my father to buy shoes. And right when we were walking down the pedestrian mall, some guy was running down the pedestrian mall and holding a assault rifle and throwing hand grenades. And without thinking much, my father took me to one of those alleys. And we waited there for 3 minutes. And those kind of events take 3 or 4 minutes to be over, maybe 10 minutes. And after that was over, my father said, okay, we're going back to buy shoes. This is what we came downtown for. And since then, I realized that those incidents that's happening in my life, including terrorist attack, including fear, including whatever else, are temporary. And pretty much the country I grew up in forced us to move forward and to not really think about the trauma that much. And after September 11 happened in the United States, and I realized that unlike my experience, everything here goes a little more to the extreme. People are stopped flying because of September 11th. People stop, taking mail because of the anthrax scare. And I started thinking about my experience. And starting in 2002, really in the beginning of 2002, I started traveling back and forth between New York. I moved to New York in 2000, at the end of 2002, but before that in Boston. I started moving traveling back and forth to Israel, photographing exact sites that suicide bombings have occurred. Now, since everything got cleaned up and repaired really, really quick, there are no traces there. And for 2.5 years, I systematically traveled back and forth between Israel and New York, photographing those sites. And again, just like what I did with the Southwest pictures, this location was assigned to me. No one told me you need to make a picture. You need to make a picture here because this is where it happened. And all those time, and I'm traveling probably 3 times a year to Israel, and I'm photographing according to lists that I got from the Ministry of State Department, basically, in Israel. But they don't tell you exactly where it happened. They usually will give you a certain cross street. They will give you a location. And then I will actually get to those places and talk to people that seems to be stationary there, cab drivers, convenience store, people that work in those spaces. This is in Park Hotel. And I will get access to photograph right where the bombing had occurred. Now, clearly, there's absolutely zero trace in my pictures, which could be very frustrating. But at the same time, it goes back to how photographs are not that good in describing, right? Because even if I had a photograph that was made a second after a suicide bombing or any kind of disaster, the photograph cannot really transcend the smell, the sound. The photograph is very, very narrow. I'm looking in one direction and there's a whole other thing that's happening on the left. Photographs are slices of reality. They are interpretation. They never really get the place or the time or the event across. But by pairing it with a certain title that talking about historical event, talking about when I actually photographed and what we can actually see, my attempt that we're going to start thinking about the relationship between text and images, the relationship between what we know and what we see. And this became my thesis show for my MFA from Columbia University. And this was the space that I created. And as I mentioned, for 2.5 years, I photographed probably close to 200 different sites of suicide bombing. I eventually only showed 6 different prints, but I also made a little book. And I handmade a book and I built this bench there in the space so people can actually sit down and look through the book. And this was the book, and the book was called Aftermath. And this is from 2005, when I finished my graduate degree. And the importance of this work was not just about what the pictures were or this dichotomy between text and image. The importance of the work that this pretty much dictated a lot of the things that I've done in the past 15 years. This project really opened up a new path of understanding space, a new path of talking about the relationship between photography and reality. And it took, 11 years until 2016 that this book came out with a trade, commercial printer. It's still called Aftermath. It's only 44 images, but it's made in the same idea and the same sequence that I had with my book dummy that I made in 2005. And as I mentioned, this really changed how I see the world and what actually I would like to do with my work. And right after I finished my grad program at Columbia, I traveled to Southeast Asia for the first time, actually. And I specifically went to Laos because in Laos, I read that during the Vietnam War, Laos had actually no war with anyone at that time, but the total amount of bombs dropped on Laos during the Vietnam War was greater than the total amount of bombs dropped on Europe during World War II on both sides, both the Allies and Germans. And that was like something that really blew my mind. And I decided I need to travel and to a specific area that's very close to the Vietnamese border and see how they deal with trauma. So in Israel, everything was cleaned up and repaired. No memorials, no signs for something that happened there. And in Laos, since there's absolutely zero money and life expectancy is still in 52 or 53 years old, and it's an incredibly poor country, there's no one to take the debris away and to reconstruct the place. And what's still happening in Laos that you can see from this photograph, that parts that from bombs, from airplanes, from tanks, from ammunition boxes, all those things became building materials to reconstruct their life. And you can see that here as well. And this is what happened actually with memory there. So rather than actually erase the memory, like what happened in Israel, or reiterate the memory, like what happened in the United States, how long we had a big hole in ground zero in Manhattan until they built something. How many times did you read about 9/11 in order to keep the memory alive? But unlike in the United States or in Israel, in Laos, there was no one to do that. And those spaces remained, scarred and destroyed, but the people actually rebuild their life using the same materials. A year later, I also traveled to the Gaza Strip, and I was interested to see how the place and how people are looking at what's supposed to be the disengagement plan from the Palestinians. The Israel government decided to disengage from the Gaza Strip and give it back to the Palestinians, but they did it by unilateral decision. And I traveled and I spent a few weeks in the Gaza Strip, and I photographed, houses that are abandoned already, graffiti, the preparation before moving out. I already photographed abandoned houses. I also crossed into more Palestinian villages and looked at, houses that were destroyed there in Palestinian villages that are waiting for Israeli troops to pull back so they can reconstruct their life. And for 2.5 weeks that I was there, I was looking at all the steps taken before the event. Unlike with Aftermath, that I was mostly interested to see what happened after the event, in pre-disengagement, I spent time and looked at the preparations ahead of that. And at the day, and even, going to go and see Palestinian workers dismantling greenhouses by settlers, right before settlers are moving back into Israel. I went to see demonstrations for and against this disengagement in Israel. And you can see that. And what I was really interested in is about the build-up, not really the event itself. I even managed to sneak into military bases and look at how the army was preparing to evacuate people by force from their home. And at the day this event happened, I pulled back and left the Gaza Strip because I knew there will be hundreds of photojournalists there that will make probably more, perhaps better picture than what I would do there. And I was not really interested in the event itself. Now, I would like to take a little pause. Everything that I've talked about so far seems to be about disaster and trauma and politics and quote unquote negative effects or things in our life. But at the same time that all this happening, I lived in Harlem there, and there's this beautiful tree outside of my window. And for 2 years that I lived in this apartment, I had two markings where to put my large format camera. And this is the camera I work with. And every now and then I will make a photograph of that tree. And the tree actually just developed and, and grew a little bit. But what was really interesting is to see how the weather and the time of the day changes the way we're looking at this tree. And as I said, for 2 years, I would make photographs probably once every week or even sometimes less. And I had 4 different seasons, and I had night and day. And sometimes the exposures were very long, and sometimes the exposures were actually kind of short, But this is an outlet for me. This was something aside from working with this really heavy and burden-like topics about human tragedy, human disaster. So I'm sharing some of these. I also made some landscape photographs at the time, some portraits that are related to my interest. But I'm going to go back now to talk about another project that I started in 2008. So in 2008, actually before that, in 2006 already, I was in a relationship with a German woman in New York, and later on she moved back to Germany. And I started going back and forth between Germany and New York. And I wanted to start a new project in Europe. And again, what I was interested in is about sites of trauma or sites of turmoil, of history that actually, and what actually becomes with those sites. So what we see right now, this is the Brandenburg Tor or gate in Berlin, which is incredibly important in terms of German history. And it became like a tourist attraction. Same with Checkpoint Charlie. Checkpoint Charlie, that as you all know, this was actually the gateway between East and West, between East Germany and West Germany. And nowadays, I don't know what's happening there, but 12 years ago when I took this photograph, there is a pseudo Russian soldier there, or Soviet soldier, actually, who's not really Soviet, who's not really a soldier. And you can photograph this person there because it's kind of a tourist attraction. And if you give him €1, you can even get a picture with him. You know, and what I was really interested is to see how those sites, from something that, you know, so packed with history and so much stuff that we know, how those sites transition into tourist attractions, how they're designed as tourist attractions as well. And even in a trip that I did to Buchenwald, to one of the few concentration camps in Germany. So on a Sunday afternoon, I met these 5 German youth coming in there for a tour on their own. And it was just like what we would maybe go to see, you know, a museum on a Saturday or on a Sunday with our family. So they were going to a concentration camp. And inside the concentration camp, there is a whole display of artifacts. And I also was interested to photograph that and how we actually experience the place and how we experience history through the decision made by museum directors, by exhibition designers. And that started a whole project that I call eventually traumatic tourism. And traumatic tourism is, again, going to significantly historical sites in Europe mostly, and a little bit in the United States, and trying to make a contemporary photograph in place where history actually took place. This is the exact location where near Humboldt University, they burned books right at the rise of the Third Reich, and that became like a monument. In Amsterdam, I got to photograph what they call the Homo Monument for LGBTQ individuals that were murdered during World War II, and even going to photograph mass graves of Russian soldiers during World War II became a photo opportunity for me, and how the visitor is actually becoming part of the scene as well. You know, next picture is maybe something that you know about the Holocaust monument in Berlin. And at the time when I went to photography, it became like a little playground. And I was interested in this transition of spaces and how they're becoming actually more contemporary in their use, and what's the relationship we have to those actual spaces. In Munich, I joined on a Third Reich tour where I was taken by this guy around Munich, in order to see where history took place. And eventually I also made a group portrait of all the people that I took the tour with. In northern Germany, near Hamburg, I went to a specific concentration camp that was for communists and women that were kept there in Neuengamme. And over there, I met this guy in the photograph who is a high school tour guide that taking students for tours in those spaces. I also met Senor Espinoza, who is a Mexican tourist who came to see concentration camps. And I made a portrait of him. In Dachau, I was very lucky to run into a group of German soldiers from the medical corps that actually came to visit Dachau. And that took me on to a quick residency in Kleve, right on the Rhine, where I'm going to be very short, but I spent 3 months photographing the local and the tourists that arrived from Netherlands to Germany, and look at how contemporary Kleve, that's the town, accepts those tourists as foreigners into their city. I also went through the archives of the city and dug out some historical photographs of that town that was completely destroyed during World War II. And what I was interested in is to see how those places were rebuilt. And during these 3 months that I spent there, I also made photographs, contemporary photographs of those old places. What used to be the synagogue is gone, and what used to be downtown Kleve this way during World War II in 2008 looked like that. And the exhibition that I hung was basically taking my photographs, put them in old frames, and take the historical photographs, put them in a book that I called Klever Zeiten, Times of Kleve, that was printed on canvas, which makes it very malleable and soft. And the portraits I made of the foreigners and the locals were out in the main hall in light boxes. Okay. So again, this obsession, quote unquote, that I have with the place actually took me also to Germany, took me to look at societies that I normally wouldn't have any access to. After as I mentioned, I was in relationship with a German woman, and when the residency ended, I went back to live with her, something that actually fell through pretty quickly. And I found myself with a couple of suitcases and my camera in Europe without a place to stay, as our relationship fell apart. And I spent the next 3 months traveling around Europe between places that I found interesting, between couches that I could actually sleep on, and friends that I would like to visit. And I spent some time in Germany and in Holland and in Gibraltar and in Spain. And I started making photographs and I had no idea what they were about. After 4 months of photographing and after I went back to Brooklyn and I started looking at those photographs, I realized that everything that I photographed was about transition, was about duality between daytime and nighttime, between reflection and between the real thing, you know, and what we see here. This is a photograph I made in Gibraltar. And what we actually see is through a glass, the majority of the country of Gibraltar, but the sunset is reflecting through the glass. So what we actually see is another distortion of the place, right? Of the actual place, how it looks like. Or when you're coming outside of Gibraltar and make this photograph, and you're coming back, 12 hours later and make this photograph, of course, the perception of a place changes dramatically. And when I came back to the United States in 2009, I showed this work at Gallery Caiaphas that happened to be the gallery that since then, until recently, was representing my work. And we also printed my first monograph that was called In Transition. In 2010, I was fortunate to be offered a new job in Hong Kong. And I was hired by an American university to travel to Hong Kong and start the new photography department for them in Hong Kong. And for the next 3 years, I taught in Hong Kong, I worked in Hong Kong, and I also, of course, photographed a lot in Hong Kong. I'm going to show you some of the pictures I made over the 3 years I lived there. But what I was really interested in was the life of the expats, those non-Hong Kongese that live in Hong Kong and enjoy the services of Hong Kong, but actually live in very separated pockets from local Hong Kongese. And this is one of the things that I was really interested in, to see how their life is actually different and what's their relationship to the space. And since I was an expat myself, I actually got some good access to people's homes, to hang out with expats, to look at something like that at Hong Kong, which I don't have to tell you how expensive is real estate there to have a tennis court, outside of your home. I got to actually be in restaurants where this interaction between cultures, the Western and the more traditional Hong Kongese or Chinese, is in Hong Kong, And this is something that I kept on doing. In fact, after 3 years of photographing and thousands of plates and hundreds of rolls of film, both in color and black and white, I still have not resolved this work, partially because I kept on moving forward, starting new projects, moving from place to place, frankly. This is one of the photographs that I made of myself during a typhoon in Hong Kong in my apartment. But being in Hong Kong also allowed me to travel and allowed me to keep on exploring those really interesting and things that I care about regarding the history of a place, history of a culture, and what actually is happening there right now. And one of the places I traveled a couple of times to was Cambodia. And Cambodia, after the first time I was ever there, I was pretty surprised and interested to hear that the majority of the conversation I had was either about the glorious past of the Angkor period, which is around 1,000 years ago, and about the temples and everything that was built there, which in fact, back then, was the most advanced society on the planet. At the time that Angkor Wat is 1 million residents, London, I think, is less than 30,000. So one thing was about talking about the glorious past of the Anchor period and kingdoms. And the second conversation I had was about the inglorious past of the Khmer period that coincide with the Vietnam War as well, that sips to Cambodia. And it was quite shocking to me to see that there's very little talk about contemporary Cambodia. I'm not even talking about the future of Cambodia. And the majority of the country, whether they are tourism or teachers or are dealing with those two major periods. What we see here is anchor temples, but you can also see a crate made by a B-52 bomb from the Vietnam War. I actually traveled to Tol Slang. Tol Slang was one of the Khmer Rouge prisons in Phnom Penh, and where all the teachers and people, the academics and intellectuals were kept and then eventually murdered. I traveled around Cambodia and found those places of significant trauma as well. As part of what I spent, as I mentioned before that, in Asia during the 3 years I lived in Hong Kong, I also traveled to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, again, I found that the Vietnam War and the Vietnam War era, is still very prominent. You can find that, still in the streets and towns in Vietnam, specifically northern Vietnam. You can actually see how American bunkers and positions that cannot be destroyed because they're made of solid concrete are becoming like roadside malls. Again, the history of the Vietnam War is incredibly present. And everywhere I pretty much went and visited, there were some traces that cannot be taken away. And that connected again for me with previous interest in photographs I made both in Israel and the United States and in Germany to look at how history is still playing a significant role in daily life. And again, going back to what I said earlier on, the relationship between knowledge and what we see, what we know about Vietnam and what we see in those photographs. I met people that actually still making a living by scrap metal from the Vietnam War. It's still a source of income. I even bought a couple of things from this guy. These are nesting dishes, trays for American soldiers from the 1960s and 70s. You can still see the traces of the war on the walls there. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to bore you with too many images from that period because I want to move forward and to talk about more recent work that actually might make more sense for you. Another pause, just like what I said before then about the tree pictures that I made. During this whole time, I'm traveling around the world with my large format camera, and I keep making photographs that maybe not have significant history as pictures, but those photographs maybe explore our relationship to space. This is a photograph I made in Australia in 2010. Again, working with a large format camera. I don't know if you know what that is, but thinking about 19th century cameras that you put a cloth over your head and you're holding a cable release in your hand. And this is my primary camera. This is what I use. And making a photograph that's both about the place, both about the action in front of me, that has also something significant in terms of time. While I was photographing Cambodia, I also made this photograph about the locals that stay underneath and looking straight at the camera versus the tourists that are climbing up those big temples in Siem Reap area. Made this photograph in Barcelona, of the Olympia Park. Again, how much photograph can capture in terms of the exact moment, the relationship of those characters to the background, to history. We can see the Gaudi cathedral on the top right there, and we can see a girl, diving into the water on the bottom left there. And what is the relationship between them? In China, a park that's supposed to imitate other cultures and significant places. For instance, this seemingly like Egypt. It's not Egypt, or even photographing in the Palestinian territories in Hebron and looking at, contemporary life in Israel. And as I mentioned, in 2013, I left Hong Kong and I moved back to Israel after 17 years that I haven't lived there. And the only travels that I did there were in order to make photographs of my projects. And my decision to move back to Israel was to see as an adult man if I can actually live there. And I settled in Tel Aviv, and a couple of weeks after I moved to Tel Aviv, I started walking around with my large camera around different neighborhoods in Tel Aviv. And I found in the southeast corner of Tel Aviv, I found this neighborhood that's been around since the 1920s. But when I walked into this neighborhood, what I found is this place is completely new to me. And in many ways, I felt it was much more cosmopolitan than anywhere in Israel that I ever been to. And the story is that it's a small neighborhood that's called Neve Sha'anan, which translates into serene oasis in English. And this neighborhood was, less than 1,000 people when it was established. And up until the 90s, it was several thousands of people lived there on the structures and on the infrastructure that was there built in the 1920s into the 50s. But in the past 20 years, there was an increasing flood of immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees, foreign workers that arrived in this neighborhood and settled there, to the point that all of a sudden this neighborhood was now home for 25,000 different people from more than 30 different cultures. And I was walking around with my large format camera and talked to people and made photographs about the neighborhood and about these people that were not even recognized by the Israeli government, and were not giving asylum, were not giving any kind of status as refugees, And within 6 months of walking around this neighborhood, making photographs, talking to people, making photographs about gentrification and about the difference between downtown Tel Aviv versus this neighborhood, I started to be recognized by some of the people that I got to photograph. And I will have in my camera bag set of prints that if I run, and I usually will run to the same person twice, I would give them photographs. But it was important for me to actually tell something about the neighborhood and about those people from the photographs, not just by the context of title. And a lot of times I tried to make a photograph that's saying something about the experience. And as you can see on the right-hand side, this guy who is a barber is working only on the weekend, because during the week he's washing dishes in a restaurant in Tel Aviv. And you can also see the tree trunk on the left, because this barbershop is in someone's backyard. This is not even a structure. And the change that happened to this neighborhood, and how this neighborhood is now accommodating people from different culture, not Israelis, not Jews, and not even Muslims specifically, but people that came from Somalia and Eritrea and Kenya and Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudanese. In one of less than a year after I was photographing in the neighborhood, there was a junkyard that I always wanted to photograph. And I tried to photograph it 3 or 4 times, and I was never really happy with the photograph after I developed it. And one day I was photographing, and while I was on the street with the big camera underneath the cloth, and I hear somebody yelling from one of the porches and asked me, what am I doing? And where is this camera? And all those things. And I explained to this person that I've been photographing for a year in the neighborhood, but I never can get a good photograph of this junkyard. And he yelled and he invited me up to his porch and asked me, would you like to try to photograph this junkyard from my porch? And I was like, of course. And I went up to his porch and I made this photograph. That started to make more sense. But the guy also opened the door to me wearing just shorts, without a shirt. He was very, very casual and very, generous to allow me in, and made me a cup of coffee and all those things. And then I asked him, do you mind if I photograph you as a resident of this neighborhood as well? I got to photograph people out on the street from different cultures. What about photographing you? And he's like, sure, no problem. And I made this photograph of him. And that was the first photograph I made in the neighborhood from inside someone's home. And after I made this photograph, I actually moved to the neighborhood, and I started asking people to come and show me their interior space if they want to share it with me. And that moved into a whole different part of this project. and making photographs inside people's homes. And all of a sudden you are facing with a home that's a living room, a kitchen, a bedroom, you know, all at once. And you're talking about something that's probably no bigger than 250 square feet apartment. You know, I also got to photograph inside people's homes that are, you know, under construction or they're falling apart. These are Christian Indians who live in the same neighborhood, a Colombian family. But the work also, the place also brought gentrification, of course, you know, and old buildings were destroyed and new buildings were placed like that. And I actually got access to this work, these spaces as well. And I kept on making those portraits and what looks like more street photography, but made with a large format 4x5 camera, and tried to tell some story about this neighborhood. I even got to be in people's homes where during the daytime, its function is illegal kindergarten for kids of refugees and asylum seekers that cannot get the services from the state of Israel. And at nighttime, it comes back to be an apartment. You know, what I mentioned before, that gentrification, sometimes in the middle of the street, the middle of the road, there will be a demolition of an entire building. As you can see, no one's really taking it seriously. They're not even blocking the streets. People keep riding through that. People, there's, you know, it's amazing what chaotic place. And then eventually they build these kind of new developments that will actually house newer residents. But my favorite was actually to photograph kids, because kids are colorblind, they are ethnicity blind in most cases. You know, they don't have everything, all the, you know, cultural clashes that their parents might have in the neighborhood. And after 2.5 years of photographing there, I actually moved back to the United States, and that was in 2017. And I also made a little self-portrait. And this is the camera that I work with. You can see in someone's home in Neve Sha'anan in Tel Aviv. The work received some attention, both the Israeli Museum, and you can see this was the installation there. I was also invited to show this work in Sweden at the Uppsala International Photography Festival in 2017. I showed this work later on in Gallery Caiaphas in Boston in 2018. You know, but that was my return to the United States. Now, Ava, a question. Am I running too late? Is that okay? Are we still fine? People are still engaged? Should I shut up? Should I continue and go faster?
Well, I was going to ask you, how much time would you like for there to be for question and answer period? Because we can
I
keep
can
going.
stay as long as you want. I actually would love, maybe I will skip this whole next project that I was about to talk to, which is my return to the United States and the big road trip I did. Maybe I should skip to what's going on in my life and my work right now, and I can be done in like 5-10 minutes.
Okay, that sounds good, Yoav.
That's good. So I'm gonna go through those, and I'm not gonna talk about this. This is from a road trip that I did in the United States 2 years ago that signified my return to American culture, to this part of the world after not living here for 7 years or so. I photographed friends, I photographed families, I photographed the US-Mexican border. But what I really want to talk about is what's happening in 2020. And as I said before, we all have to keep going, and we all have to keep, you know, some sort of a positive outlook, even though 2020 has been probably the most turmoil year that I've known in my life, maybe. So when I moved back to the States, and specifically to New Hampshire, I was looking for a new project. I was looking for a new reach out. And I found this NGO in Manchester, New Hampshire, that taking care of African refugees families that arrived in New Hampshire in the past 10 years and provide them with training and land to become farmers. And I started in late 2017, early 2018, traveling to those farms, helping the farmers, working once a week on the farm, but at the same time making photographs. And I was making photographs both to help the NGO, and they were using those works, but mostly the reason why I photographed is because I noticed that in 98%, New Hampshire is 98% white, Caucasian. And people that are coming from different color, from different culture, they don't speak English, are usually going to be marginalized. And looking at those people that arrived in the country from war-torn Africa and are coming into the States and working in farms, but still not getting the appreciation or the recognition as people that moved in the United States in the 19 teens or 20s to work in the mills, or even late 19th century, which are the exact same people in some way. New Americans, people that came to rebuild, to cultivate the land, as we can see it here in New Hampshire, are very much like the people who came in the late 19th century to start the mills, to inhabit the land of the Northeast and the South, And since 2018, as I mentioned, I've been photographing regularly with the large format in those two farms. I work both in color and black and white. I also photograph the people who work in the offices for them. I give them prints and give them photographs to use to promote their work. And what I wanted was to actually expose this part of New England, in New Hampshire and in Vermont and in Maine, to the majority of people that don't know these people even exist. And my strategy was to make both portraits, both still lifes of the produce that being actually produced there, and landscape photographs, specifically in the fall. And this is from 2 years ago, fall 2 years ago. And then what happens there in the winter. So you can see those are photographs that are very new. They're from the past couple of years, but they could be incredibly historic as well. So I would go to those farms year round and even in the summer and try to make those photographs about the place, about actually what's happening there, off season and on season. You can see that this is definitely off season. Nothing really grows at the time. I will rush through these. More people that work and part of this organization, and then photograph what's happening in the spring as well. And this is from the spring of last year. The work did get attention. It was, a couple of magazines in New England area. It was exposed already in a couple of different exhibitions. And I have to say that I was happy to see that the revenue of those organizations actually increased. We did some fundraisers. I got to photograph the kids of the farmers. I got to look at actually what happens between two different generations. And this project really has been going on for me for more than 2 years. I'm not done with that by any means. But as you know, last winter, so this is going into winter of last year. More portraits. I'm sorry, I probably just used too many pictures. I even managed to create those personal relationship with them that I was invited to weddings of the farmers in New Hampshire. This is from last year. And last winter, when things started to die again, as you can see here, and into snow, I was looking forward for the spring, but then what happened? What happened. And we find ourselves under quarantine. And when that started in March, I started taking regular walks around Boston and photographing with my large format camera again, those empty streets of Boston and how life was sucked out of them immediately. And in fact, in Boston, it's even more interesting because Boston, in terms of architecture, has a combination of old, historical, and new architecture. And how those photographs that are almost typography of streets and places in Boston, what do they actually describe? But more so what they described was my feeling around this time. Going out there completely by myself. There's no one else around. It doesn't matter if it's 8 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock in the morning. To hear your footsteps, to walk around with a large format camera, to see what actually happens with light on its own, with no interruption of people, And it was a very meditative and very eerie experience. After 6 weeks of photographing, when the curfew was starting to lift off, I find myself starting to fight with people not crossing my frame and cars passing. And I decided that this is probably the time for me to stop photographing, because it's not about the quarantine anymore. It's about making photographs of empty spaces. So I stopped doing that. And Ava, I apologized. and I'm going to go into the last little thing that I want to talk about, and we can actually use that as a platform for questions, you know. And in July, I was called, you know, while I was working on those photographs and those prints, I was called down to Virginia to photograph Confederate monuments as they are actually being taken down. And I spent 2 weeks again in Virginia with another photographer from New York named Chris Graves. This is me making those photographs with my camera. This is Chris Graves that I traveled with. And while we were there, a lot of things were happening. Other than the fact that we were threatening, there were monuments that defaced. This is actually the Arthur Ashe monument. Sometimes we went to photograph a monument after just graffiti was placed on it. And on the next day, the monument was completely gone. You know, I got to photograph a lot around the Robert E. Lee Memorial that became like a community center. And as always, I work in a couple of different formats, looked at the transition of those monuments after being there and basically controlling and hovering over life in Richmond, Virginia, how they actually about to change as well. We also traveled to Charlottesville and to Washington and Alexandria and photographed a couple of dozen different monuments. Came back to the darkroom. This is a picture of my negative, and this is how a positive looks like. Should I open it for questions right now, Eva, while I'm showing some pictures from Virginia?
Yes, please. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, or you can drop them in the Zoom chat box and we will moderate them from there. I wrote down my own question while you were talking about it, but you certainly, you know, answered it as you go on, as you've gone on to this last section, which was about the traumatic tourism. And my question was, you know, do plantations in the American South, is that under your scope of traumatic tourism?
This is a very good question, because, you know, I was not born in the United States, but I have been teaching it for 16 years. And when I went down to photograph in the South, or when I actually go and photograph in the United States in general, a lot of times I find myself informing my students or people that are interested about American history, you know. And one of the things that keeps on going is this, what you just described as tourism that going down to Civil War, Gettysburg, right? Gettysburg is one of the biggest tourist attractions, right? But the question is, what do actually people get to remember from Gettysburg? And what are they being told about Gettysburg and about the Civil War? And I noticed when I went down to Virginia, you know, and I got to photograph, you know, defacing those monuments, a lot of people did not even know what the when the monuments were erected. The fact that they were not erected during the Civil War, the fact that they were erected by individuals and organizations that would like to somehow rewrite history there. And what do people actually go to see in Gettysburg, and why, you know? But going even to see, you know, a Confederate cemetery, Confederate soldier cemetery, Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, and then the next day to go and photograph Black African-American, you know, cemetery that's completely being let go, that's, you know, being overgrown. You just understand even further more what is systematic racism in the United States. It does work in terms of traumatic tourism, but I think that history is around us everywhere we go. And part of what I want to do with my work is also highlight those places, highlight that, you know, sites that are incredibly important, that are becoming just mundane, you know. By the way, the vast majority of monuments that I got to photograph were removed since then, except of the Robert E. Lee, you know, and by pressure by people and by pressure by government, of course. And sometimes it takes so much actually for things to move, you know. Does it answer your question somehow? Somehow.
It does. And I was also just thinking, there is, in my opinion, just kind of new reference to some of those American plantations, because it just felt like for a long time, people were very happy to be there. If you had a chance to like say visit one in South Carolina or Virginia, or even, you know, Monticello, people are very excited to be there. And that's not quite exactly the same feeling that you might get, say, in Germany. So I just wondered, you know, are there different?
Yeah. I actually did go to Monticello, you know, to photograph and to really look at how this place is being, you know, whitewashed in some way, you know, and to, you know, kind of erase the real history of Monticello. But they wouldn't let me come in with my cameras. And this is after they also asked for $40. And I was like, this is really ridiculous. You know, you're asking money to look at American history and you curbing my right to photograph there. So I'm just not going to include you, you know. But it's very much true. You know, those monuments that specifically that we're photographing are praising an inglorious past. You know, my parents-in-law, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law are what we can call Catholic, Italian Americans, veterans, traditional, however you want to, whatever categories of, you know, of sectionized you can actually put them. In a conversation I had with them after I came back with those pictures, they were very upset that I gave hand to erase history, you know. And I had to explain to them that this is not erasing history. I'm sorry. This is actually recognizing this history. And this history is not, should be gone, but we should learn from this history. And there's no reason why those monuments that were erected to praise a very disturbing and problematic history, there's no reason why they should dominate the public sphere, you know. And when they still actually pushed against that, so I went into the other side. And I was like, you know that my father is a Holocaust survivor, right? And they said, of course, and our prayers is with your family and all that. And I was like, Germany has a phenomenal history. Can you imagine if World War II was celebrated in monuments all around Germany? Wouldn't you think that this is going to be a problem for millions of people around the world? You know, and how is it different than this? No one is erasing that, but there's no reason to put Jeb, you know, Stewart or Robert E. Lee, people that actually worked very hard to segregate and to create, you know, a much more white supremacy control in the South or everywhere. And I think that this is where it hit a chord. When you actually talk about your own experience and your own, you know, how is it actually pretty much the same worldwide?
All right, well, we do have some questions in the chat box. We'll start with Dr. Spector, who asked, how would you characterize life in Israel in the context of the existential threats and life in the USA these days?
These days? Yeah, this is a great question. I think that what's been going on in Israel in the past 20 years is moving more and more to the right and more into a nationalistic and almost theocracy in my way of thinking about it. But this is something that we actually see all over the world. We see that the rise of nationalism, both in Europe, in South America, in North America, and in Israel, is actually driving away multiculturalism and diversity in many places. You know, how do I see the relationship between them? I think that, you know, we can talk about that, and I will have to reveal my very liberal left-wing outlook on the world if I will say what I say. And I don't want it to really get to that point. But this is something that I also noticed wherever I lived. And I lived in Hong Kong, and I lived in Germany, and I lived in Israel, and I lived in the United States, and I spent some time in South America. Every culture, every group of people will always define a group of the others, people that are not like us, people that are different, that we are maybe superior to. And you can actually even see it in Hong Kong. People from mainland China, you know, are looked down upon from Hong Kongese, even though you're talking about very similar ethnicity, same language, even if you're talking about Southern China, talking about Cantonese, you know, but there's still kind of separation. There's us and there is them. And this is something that I keep pushing against with my work, you know, not necessarily with COVID as we're looking at right now, but working with African refugees in New England for the past 3 years, photographing in Europe, photographing in Bolivia. There's a whole other project that I worked on for the past 5 years that I haven't finished yet, that I did not even mention here. Does it answer your question, Professor Spector? Somehow? And there was silence.
Okay. All right. Well, we can go on to the next question, which is on the notion that images are only a slice or interpretation of reality. Do you think adding text provides a more accurate representation or fuller representation of that reality?
I think that text, and this is something that I work with my students as well, text is incredibly important and incredibly deceiving, and there's the example could be anywhere. The example could be even from that, adding text that will define the place and the time will add layer of information. It might actually even tint the way we're looking at spaces, right? Because when I worked on Aftermath, or when I worked on other projects that had to do with a specific place, as soon as I'm introducing the name of the place or what actually happened there, you have to look at this place a little differently, right? And this is true for both traumatic and wonderful instances. If history happens around us in any given moment, right? And people are born, fall in love, die, get hurt, all the time around us. History happens on this street, corner, around the street corners where we live, and pointing out the visual and pointing out the historical context will definitely change the way we're looking at the place, and I'm trying to be very conscious about that. And of course, it's adding another layer of information, but who says that this information is actually truthful? I keep stressing to my students as well, photographs are never truthful. They are a slice of time. They are a slice of reality. The fact that you're looking now at photographs made in Boston in 2020 is because I told you that I took them in 2020, but these photographs could have been taken in 2019 if I was lucky enough to not have people there. I can also make those photographs and remove those people in Photoshop, but that's not the point, right? And I do think that text information is adding layers of information to the photograph, but not necessarily truthful information. And there's also a limit, as what I mentioned before that with Aftermath project. A photograph that I made of the space really described the space where suicide bombing had happened. But does it really describe the suicide bombing? Can you actually smell it? Can you see it? Can you imagine what it is? And what if I had a camera that was there right on the spot? Would that be a more accurate description? Because as soon as we're looking at one thing in one direction, there's a whole world behind us that we're missing, And photographs are slices of reality, same as writing, same as poetry. We are just deciding to look at a certain space with certain pair of glasses, which is true for writing, it's true for photography, it's true for filmmaking, it's true for being, anything, right? There's no really objectivity in some way, right?
Okay, I was sent another question by text message, and it is about the photos that you have shared from, I would say, 2020, but also maybe your last project. Are they available on, say, like your personal website so they can go back and go look?
Yes. So everything up until New American Farmers, which is the work that I'm doing in New Hampshire with the farmers, is available on my website. I'm now working on uploading both the Boston under quarantine pictures and my work from Virginia. I'm actually working right now on a little book dummy, a publisher that was interested in the work that I did in Virginia. So I'm a little slow to update my work online, but a lot of previous work is online on my website, which is myfullname.com. Yes, and considering the fact that I also teach 3 courses a semester for the past 15 years, that takes a lot of time from my schedule as well. So as the semester is almost over in 4 weeks, I will have more time to do that over winter break and to really dig dip into work that I actually haven't realized or haven't actually concluded yet.
Well, that's wonderful. If there are any other questions, now is the time to ask them. I'm not seeing any more, but
I think is my microphone working now?
Yes, there you are. Okay, yes.
Yeah, I discovered I had a loose USB cable. I just really wanted to thank Yoav for such a brilliant presentation. And I made a comment in the chat box. We need to distribute this as widely as we can. And I want to thank Brian O'Connor also for recommending that we reschedule this. So this has been wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm sorry I can't see the chat, so I don't even know if there are any comments or questions or things that I can actually address or should address.
I think when Ava shares it, she can share the chat.
Oh, now I can see that.
Okay, everyone can see the, Yoav, can you see the comments in the chat yet?
Now looking at the chat and I see 19 messages. There it is. Thank you. This is wonderful.
Yeah. And I also would like to just echo everything that Mike said, which is, thank you to you for sharing these wonderful images. And thank you to Brian for bringing you to our attention. We're just so thankful that we could get this scheduled. And, this was, again, something that we had scheduled in March. We hope to see you in person and share these wonderful images. But, we are still under quarantine. Yeah.
So looking forward to travel and see you all and have this, lecture in person. And I don't like teaching on Zoom, but this is reality for us. I still have my ticket to Dallas that maybe I'll get to use in some point, when it's going to be safe and fine to travel. But I'm really glad that we worked it out on Zoom. And and you can always email me from my website if you have any specific questions or concerns. I'm used to get emails and sometimes get hate emails. I got some hate emails after the Virginia work, people that compared me to Nazis. And I will try to, people are entitled for their opinion, but unfortunately, when it's not based on anything really coherent, that's going to be a little annoying. And I will say that again. My work as an artist, as a photographer, took me in so many different places, and I cannot be even starting to be that thankful for the opportunities that I had. And if I could make some change with my work and show, share a beam of light on topics that I think are important and should be actually highlighted, so I'm trying to do that. Yeah.
Can I jump in here and just say, as
Please.
always, both the images and your words are always compelling. I'm a little upset with the COVID that we can't just go for coffee now with a few folks and chat about it more, but we'll get you here at some point.
Yes, I would love to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, well, we will be sure to update when you get those finished projects on your website. And we'll make sure that there is an available link to this for YouTube as well. So thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who attended and stuck with us. Really inspiring work. So thank you for that.
Enjoy
thanks to Ava and Adam for getting this organized. And thanks especially to Yoav and to Brian. And we had quite a few people, posting and responding. So this has been outstanding.
Thank you. That's great to hear.
Yep, wonderful job.
It was a little longer than planned. This is how I talk usually in terms of one-to-one, and I think that it was a little too long for Zoom. But as long as you stayed engaged and you didn't flip, it's all good.
No, we absolutely were engaged. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ava. See you all up.
Talk to you soon.